Malcolm, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 16, written by Cathy McCrae, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Chapter 1. This night was different from the countless ones before it. Malcolm could feel it in his ghostly bones. He'd waited what seemed like forever for Soni to take notice of him. Of course, he'd been waiting nearly 270 years to be free of the aimless drifting space between life and death, and a few days more or less shouldn't matter. But it did. He wanted to get away, yearned to breathe the air and walk the moors without fearing the sudden memories of battle. To spend one day, just one day, without falling to the ground in helpless surrender to the horrors that stalked his mind, the lingering effects of war. Mists lay heavy on the ground as the cool summer night blended with the lingering warmth of the day past. The ghosts Soni hadn't yet sent on their quest idled about the campfire, some in huddled groups of 2 or 3, others alone as they pondered some memory from their past. A few had not yet risen from the misty moor, but they were those who rarely left their graves. Malcolm recalled the night of summer solstice only a few days earlier, when their charming mascot Sansaray, who was obviously something other than just a precocious child who could see ghosts, had arrived with her proposal. It had been a beautiful night full of promise for one such as him, who lived only partly behind the veil that separated the living from the dead. He could remember few times he had felt so alive since the fateful day that had ended his life on Mossy Moor in 1746. The solstices were like that, though, breathing a new awareness in his soul, though he'd felt no premonition of things to come. This time, however, Soni, as they called her, offered them the gift they all longed for, to step past the veil and emerge among the living again, even if only for a short time. And the added boon, to say what was on each man's mind to their ill-fated leader, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and perhaps free Malcolm at last of the disquieting memories that plagued him. Malcolm's view of Culloden was crystal clear, even in the dark of a moonless night, for nearly 300 years of memories, intrusive, distressing, haunted him. The waning sliver of moon, as it had been that fateful night in 1746, was quick to trigger his memory. Even the pervasive aroma of the damp moor recalled to mind the odour kicked up by churning boots charging through the mud. Some days he woke to the tourist-filled day-to-day life on Culloden's battlefield, but on others, at the whim of sound or circumstance, he relived the horror of war and defeat. The other 78 ghosts who shared the moor took care to avoid him on those days. Only the wee ghost Robbie and his equally ghostly dog, Dauphin, dared to venture near, and the sight of the dog's head as it rested companionably on his thigh comforted him. But Robbie and Dauphin had stepped through the veil long days ago, leaving an enormous black hole in Malcolm's heart that threatened to consume him. His fingers twitched, nervous to be alone on the moor should a fit of memory take him. He stared into the night, wondering what a difference Soni's challenge would make. Stars winked overhead, and the moon sent its cold white light across the moor. This night he saw it as it was the day of 16th April 1746, when Jacobite stood, hungry and weary and cold, against the bloody English. He had escaped death only the day before, when his regiment, led by the Earl of Cromartie, was set upon by government forces and the Earl of Sutherland's stragglers. Fresh from the success of capturing a French ship said to be laden with gold and arms, the Earl of Cromartie had ordered his men to Dunrobin Castle, the Earl of Sutherland's home. The Earl was known to be in league with the English. His wife, however, was sympathetic to the Jacobites. With the luck of the devil himself, the Earl of Sutherland barely escaped the Jacobites through a back door of the castle, declaring Dunrobin Castle now in the hands of the Jacobites. The Earl of Cromartie toasted the Countess with a goblet of rather fine wine before he and his troops departed to rejoin Prince Charles' forces at Inverness. Heady with their victories, Malcolm and his comrades in arms trudged onward, somewhat envious of the officers who lagged farther and farther behind, astride their horses. But there was little concern, for surely the mounted lads offered a swift measure of protection should the need arise, and everyone believed the Earl of Sutherland's men to be completely routed and no danger to the brave Jacobite soldiers. But some Sutherlands remained in the hills, and when General Loudon's men attacked the marching Jacobites in the gap between the officers and soldiers, the Sutherlands quickly joined the fight, capturing most of the straggling officers. Many of the Jacobite soldiers were killed, the rest driven into the waters of Loch Fleet, where many drowned. Malcolm, a strong swimmer who had grown up in the far northern reaches of Sinclair land, had surfaced some distance away, lingering in the bitterly cold water until he thought he would perish, watching as the government forces marched what remained of his regiment away. Scarcely able to move from the cold, freezing the very marrow of his bones, surrounded by bodies floating in the icy water, the cries of his fallen friends ringing in his ears, he crept away and silently joined the only other brethren he knew, the Jacobite army near Inverness. He found himself in a regiment of Frasers and huddled gratefully near the fire as dawn's first streaks lit the horizon. They were quickly mustered, forming up near the right flank of the front line, amid grumblings that the battle should have been fought the night before. The officers' poor planning had sent the Frasers across Malcolm's path, fortuitously enough for his sake, but the result was they little resembled the army Prince Charles anticipated. They were cold, hungry and weary, and facing the guns of the Hanoverian army. The twitter of birds and sighing wind gave way to the creak of wheels and the snort of horses. The men stared across Dramossy Moor, over the marshlands and ponds. They scrugged their bonnets, those who still had them, pulling them low over their brows so they wouldn't fall off in the ensuing battle. Each of them had lost a friend or brother in recent days, and their fierce faces reflected their rage and need for revenge. Men shifted restlessly, their hands clenching and relaxing on their weapons, mostly spears or swords, many of which had belonged to soldiers now deceased. Musket fire opened, and the men around Malcolm charged across the moor, the force of their attack carrying him with them as they leapt over tussocks and splattered through shin-deep puddles of icy water. The left flank was hindered by numerous bogs, and the front line quickly skewed across the field. Malcolm's regiment fired their muskets, then tossed them aside with a challenging roar as they charged the government forces. The Jacobite line staggered beneath the heavy assault from the Hanoverians and was soon consumed. Believing himself the sole survivor of the rout by Sutherland's men the day before, and unwilling to escape death once only to face it again on Culloden's bloody moor, Malcolm fought with ferocity and vengeance, felling 6 men before a bayonet found its mark in his breast. It was the sound of the musket fire, the smell of the smoke, and the cries of the wounded and dying that consumed him now, and he startled to realize Soni stood before him.
Would you care to take a short walk with me, Malcolm?
She asked, her voice full of concern. Embarrassed to realize she caught him at his weakest, he shook his head to clear the memories, offering her the best smile he possessed. "Aye, 'tis not every day I get asked to walk out by a pretty lass." She wrinkled her pert nose as she gave a soft laugh, knowing, as Malcolm did, her heart was engaged elsewhere. It didn't take much of an effort to realize she and number 79 shared a special bond, though it was difficult to believe anything would come of it. Two souls separated by nearly 3 centuries, yet entwined in an unexpected way. A connection Malcolm had never experienced in his short life, and a wee bit of envy tweaked his heart. Though her affection, other than the fondness she showed each of the other ghosts, was beyond his reach, Malcolm still thought her bonny, and didn't mind the jealous looks sent his way for being singled out by their sweet Soni.
Have you thought on the challenge?
She asked as they strolled away from the others, their feet leaving no prints on the dew-laden grass. Malcolm marvelled, perhaps for the 1000th time, at how the landscape had changed after the marsh had been drained more than 200 years earlier. Too late to do the Jacobites any good, for the boggy ground had greatly hindered them. But the footing was much better for the tourists, Malcolm supposed, though it scarcely bothered him now. "Little else has crossed my mind," he admitted. "I didn't know the way of it, but we deserve better than a long march and a bloody death at the hands of the government army."
And I understand how you must feel, treating death once at the loch, only to find it on the moor.
They walked a moment more, then stopped, facing each other.
Are you ready to accept your chance to do a heroic deed and to receive your boon?
The heel of Malcolm's right hand rubbed his chest at the entry site where the bayonet had done its damage. It was a habit he'd tried to rid himself of over the years, but the ache and therefore the action remained. "Aye, give me my dragon to slay, and ready a room for me and Prince Charles to meet," he shrugged, a haunted twinkle in his eye. "And mayhap a comely lass to rescue."
Cheerlich will be waiting to hear from you as bargained,
she reassured him, pronouncing the name in Gaelic as the Highlanders did, making it sound much like Charlie, and no wonder the prince was often referred to by that name. Malcolm boiled with the need to confront the young pretender. He and nearly 2,000 of the prince's followers had lain down their lives at Culloden, whilst their leader fled the field, leaving the men to their fate.
Remember the caution, Malcolm. You have one day, mayhap a few hours more to accomplish your task. Dinna forget.
"I have an excellent incentive," he observed wryly, his fingers, grey from the frostbite he'd not lived long enough to fully develop, absently rubbing his chest again. "I willna forget." He halted, question in his eyes. "Will the memories go away if I succeed?" Soni's lips tilted in compassion.
When your fears are confronted, they will trouble you no more.
Though not the clear answer he wanted, he accepted the knowledge he would someday be rid of the deep sorrow and relentless nightmares that recalled his past and had framed every waking day since. A chance to be free of them. He was getting his chance and could beg no better boon. He and Soni had strayed a fair bit from the bonfire she'd lit earlier in the evening, and as they retraced their steps, the sky brightened, bursting into a brilliant morning. To Malcolm's surprise, the moor was no longer underfoot, and steep hills sprang up on every side. A narrow road wound through the tiny glen he'd found himself in, and small pieces of dusty grey rock crunched beneath his feet. Trees, vibrant with spring growth, sporting every delicate shade of pink and green and white, crowded thickly around the edge of the glen and up the mountainsides. A small, plank building of weathered wood shingles stood to his right, and a metal-topped shed appeared a bit farther away to his left. In the centre of the glen, immediately in front of him, an enormous fire raged. Chapter 2. Malcolm squinted his eyes against the glare. Yellow and orange flames leapt upward, reaching eager fingers toward the brilliant blue sky above. The dance mesmerized him, but after a moment he became aware of a young woman, her red hair a challenge to the blaze before her. She stood to one side, speaking to an older man, seeming unconcerned with the immense bonfire. She glanced up, staring at Malcolm as she marked his presence. With a word to her companion, she crossed the yard toward Malcolm, her long stride covering the ground with effortless grace. Malcolm was intrigued.
Hi, I'm Allison. How may I help you?
She glanced at the timepiece on her wrist.
We hadn't planned to open today.
The smile she offered him didn't match the clouded sorrow in her lovely green eyes. A kindred spirit, he felt the pull of her sadness in his soul. Malcolm was captivated. She waved a hand in a vague gesture.
Since you're here, how many in your group?
Group? Malcolm asked, wrinkling his brow, perplexed as he glanced about him. He saw no one else close by. Allison stared pointedly at his kilt.
I thought perhaps you were from a reenactment group.
She tilted her head.
You surely don't wear this every day.
Malcolm startled. Malcolm, my lad, we aren't in Scotland any more. An easy grin slid across his face. 'Tis my usual garb, aye. I didn't bring else. Her eyebrows shot upward.
And a brogue to match.
She motioned for him to follow her as she strode across to the wooden building with a wraparound porch.
Nice.
Where are we going? He asked.
To get you signed up. You did want a tour, didn't you?
He opened his mouth to ask what he was touring, but the wind shifted, and the aroma of fermenting grains wafted over him. He inhaled deeply, his eyes closing with pleasure. I dinna know what you're distilling, lass, but I'm eager to find out. She gave him a curious look.
Whiskey. This is the Sutherland distillery, makers of fine Tennessee whiskey.
He checked. Darkness clouded his vision, and the echo of long-dead cries pounded his ears. Cold prickled his skin, and he clenched his fists against the flash of memory. A hand, warm and alive, touched his gently.
Are you okay?
Allison asked. Gasping, as though he was drowning, Malcolm struggled to push his way through to the present. He swallowed once and took a deep breath, steadying himself. Sutherland, did you say? His eyes narrowed, as though the aroma from the distillery suddenly turned sour. Her look turned guarded.
Yes. Why?
He shrugged. I am Malcolm Sinclair. The Sinclairs and the Sutherlands have been feuding since before I was born. He glanced about, getting his bearings, noting the wheeled vehicles in the lot across the street, and especially the casual blue pants. Jeans, he remembered they were called, and pale grey collared shirt Allison wore. But I suppose that doesn't matter anymore.
The last feuds around here were between the Hatfields and the McCoys,
she told him, a touch of a smile lighting her eyes. Despite his distrust of her as Sutherland, Malcolm was entranced by the transformation as her smile dispelled the sorrow on her face. He shook his head. I didn't know them. He considered the duty before him. Could the lass be in some sort of trouble? Was he to help her? It was a sobering thought. He had no desire to help a Sutherland, though she could scarcely be linked to the ones who had slaughtered his friends on the road to Inverness. He glanced around the yard. The scene was peaceful, busy, likely profitable, judging from the smells rolling from the brick building across the narrow street. He cast a sideways look at the young lass, noting her smile was gone. Why was she sad? And why did a sorrowing Sutherland dismay him so? She approached the door to the weathered building, their footsteps clattering hollowly on the grey aged boards of the porch. Fumbling at the knob, she inserted a key in the lock.
Wait here,
she told him, a firm motion of her hand reinforcing the command. The door closed behind her, leaving Malcolm outside. A steady beep pulsed a warning tone both outside and within. The irritating noise soon stopped, and Alison opened the door.
You can come in now,
she invited, and Malcolm stepped up the single step into the dimly lit room. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he was fairly certain this wasn't it. The new tourist centre at Culloden battlefield, which he'd haunted for close to 10 years now, was a marvel of modern architecture. Rugged stone and glass walls which looked out over the battlefield, artefacts, art, and interactive informational sites quickly immersed the visitor into the day Malcolm would just as soon forget. This visitor centre sent him back in time as soon as his foot crossed the threshold. Memories of his family home crashed over him, and he half expected his ma to enter the room, apron pinned to her dress, flour dusting her nose. From the low ceiling and dim lighting to the rustic hewn walls and planked floor, it captured the essence of a bygone era. Leatherworks, likely stiff as a pikestaff with age and lack of use or care, hung from the walls, recalling a time when horses and oxen were the farmer's chief source of power in the field. A long rifle rested over the door, though Malcolm doubted it had been fired in a century or more. Peculiar boxes and bottles lined a shelf behind a counter along one wall, and he stepped forward for a closer look, dodging the tables of t-shirts, towels, mugs and glasses in the centre of the room.
Just sign here,
Alison directed, spinning a sheet of paper his direction on the counter. She plucked a pen down beside it and reached for a small box in a container on a shelf behind her. She twisted a knob on its top, and it emitted a whoosh of static before she dialed it back. "I've seen those before," Malcolm said, before he could stop himself. She gave him a peculiar look, and he grabbed the pen and signed his name on the top line with a flourish. "Aye, though the last one had a GPS system in it, so the tourist wouldn't get lost," he added nonchalantly, as he slid the paper and pen back to her, proud he'd remembered the letters, though what they stood for completely escaped him. Good Path System was what he privately called it, for the paths marking the battlefield were clearly marked. He'd never tried to understand how the little boxes worked, but he'd seen the markings on them on the rare occasion he'd peered over a tourist's shoulder. Distracted by his movement, Alison glanced at the paper as she picked it up.
Malcolm, right?
She set the sheet on the shelf along with the pen.
That's a rather fancy scrawl you have.
His eyebrows raised in surprise. He hadn't written his name in too many years to matter, but had often done so at his father's business. He'd had a bit of skill with the pen and enjoyed signing bills and invoices, proud of his penmanship. Did people not care about handwriting anymore?
I suppose it makes it more difficult for anyone to copy your signature,
she added as she rounded the counter with a twist of her hips, motioning him to follow.
Let's get started, if you don't mind. Do you need a restroom break before we go? We'll likely be gone a half hour or so.
Did he? What a peculiar question from this slip of a lass. In his day, a lad simply stepped behind a convenient bush for a bit of privacy, though he'd not availed himself of such in decades. Apparently, this new generation was both a bit more formal and a bit more private about such things. The visitor centre at Culloden boasted very nice facilities for a number of people to use at once. He'd seen them and marvelled at the bright mechanics of it. Curiosity got the better of him. "Aye, can you show me where?" Alison stepped smartly forward, leading him down a short hall to another room. Malcolm stopped short in surprise. Though built with the same rough lumber as the room he'd just left, this area was much larger, with a vaulted ceiling soaring above his head, and light pouring through windows on either side. A large stone fireplace rose against the far wall, though it was not in use, and several comfortable chairs sat on a large, hand-worked rug in a variety of muted colours. A tall counter lined with stools was tucked into a corner of the room, and a glassed-in display stood to his right, capturing his attention. Leaving his course in Alison's wake, he abruptly spun on his heels and struck toward the glass case. He halted, hands on hips, feet planted apart, as familiarity settled warmly over him. Culloden and its bloody aftermath dissipated like a fog before a stiff wind, bringing another memory he'd long thought buried. Holding on to his wrath that Prince Charles Stuart had sustained him these long years, the flashing power of memories, forever ingrained in his soul, forcing back thoughts of the life he'd led, leaving him only a shell of the man he'd once been. A memory, stronger than hatred and war, filled his being, and he released his breath on a sigh. Home. He was reminded of home. Chapter 3. "Tell me about this," he said, circling his hand into the air to indicate the display before him. Alison halted at his side. A faint scent of lemon wafted from her, and Malcolm breathed deep.
This shows our distillation process,
She told him, leaning forward to point to the far left side of the exhibit.
These bags show the grains we use: corn, rye, and malt barley.
Malcolm's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Corn? You make whiskey with corn?" Alison gave him a curious look.
As I mentioned before, we distill a Tennessee whiskey here. A high corn content is a requirement.
Malcolm rubbed his chin. "I understand malted barley. I didn't know about corn." Alison smiled.
Corn was first used to make whiskey in 1789 by Reverend Elijah Craig. It was the first bourbon whiskey named for the county he lived in.
"Aye, then. Changes," he mused. "Always changes." He bobbed his head, accepting her words. "Do you malt your own barley?"
No, we purchase it malted. It grows better in cooler weather than we have here, so we buy ours from a source in the Dakotas.
He had no idea where the Dakotas were, but dismissed the information as trivial as he eyed the display, mentally noting each figure. Tanks to ferment the wort, then a tank to collect the wash and move it to the still. He stopped, transfixed by the tall column. "Is this your still?" Alison tapped his arm.
Why don't we start the tour and let me show you the real thing?
Malcolm glanced at her fingers resting lightly on his sleeve. They were long and shapely, with short, pale pink nails. She wore no rings, but the edge of her watch protruded from her sleeve. Warmth seeped through the cloth of his jacket, directly beneath her fingertips, startling him. It had been many years since he'd felt the touch of another. Too many years, and the novelty of it sent a tingle up his arm. "I would love to see your fermenters," he said, clearing his throat to rid it of a sudden, raspy quality he couldn't explain. Alison's startled gaze flew to his, and he marvelled at the lovely bright green of her eyes. A slight smile tilted his lips.
Right.
She stepped away.
I'll give you a moment in the restroom, and you can meet me at that door in a few minutes,
She said, angling her head to indicate a pair of double doors near the corner bar. Malcolm started to tell her he didn't really need to use the restroom, but remembered his earlier admission and decided to take a peek inside just to satisfy his curiosity. The ones at the Culloden Visitor Centre had been quite nice, and it would be nice to see how the privies here measured up. He stepped through the appropriately marked door and peeked inside. To his amusement, 2 upright whiskey barrels formed the base of the sinks, and sitting atop the shelf were 2 whiskey bottles with the Sutherland emblem printed on the label, filled with a pinkish liquid. That can't be whiskey. He lifted one of the bottles, staring curiously at the slender straw-like stems sticking up from the cap. A tiny cluster of the pink substance clung to the end, and he touched a finger to it. He sniffed it cautiously. A floral scent filled his nostrils. Oh, 'tis a fancy lady's soap. He sat the bottle down with a slight thump of disgust and stopped himself from wiping the residue on his kilt. Not for all the whiskey in Scotland will I smell like that all day. He stared at the faucet which should dispense water. He passed a hand beneath the opening, and water gushed forth. Startled, he jerked his hand back, and the water stopped. Intrigued, he slid his hands back and forth, and the stream of water pulsed from the faucet. Grinning at the modern convenience, he quickly rinsed the offending soap from his hands, then wiped them on his kilt. His curiosity appeased and impressed by the quaint yet quite modern fixtures, he re-entered the high-ceilinged room. Alison glanced at her watch. He hurried to the door.
I'll just mention the fact that the distillery is on several different levels and the stairs can be steep. Any problems with that?
Malcolm thought of the miles of moor he'd marched when he'd been alive. A few steps, steep or not, were hardly likely to give him pause. No problem.
Any issues with heights? The floors are open metal grating, and you will be able to see straight down at least 2 stories much of the time.
That willna bother me either, lass. A pink flush tinted her cheeks, and Malcolm thought he'd never seen anything prettier. She averted her eyes, her gaze settling on his legs.
I normally point out that it isn't a good idea for ladies to walk around upstairs with skirts on. The men might glance upward.
She nodded at his kilt.
Any problems there?
Malcolm's eyes crinkled. You'll have to ask the lads. It may be a bit embarrassing for them should they look up.
Oh my. What do you wear, under your kilt?
I dare not say, he murmured, remembering the ribald jokes among the visitors at the centre, certain they were not appropriate to be repeated in such fair company. Alison frowned, the pink blush leaving her cheeks.
Don't worry, it's only a short crew today.
She rubbed her forehead with the back of a hand.
I fired the master distiller 2 days ago.
And you weren't going to open today? Malcolm finished for her. I am sorry, lass. I shouldn't be a bother to ye. She jerked out of her slouch, adding a bright smile to her lips.
Don't worry. I need to do a walkthrough anyway, and I'm glad for the distraction.
If it makes you smile, I'm happy to provide the diversion, Malcolm murmured, pleased to note the flush of pink steel back into her cheeks. One fine eyebrow lifted as she stirred him back into his role of a tourist, a gentle, silent shouting for him to mind his manners. Apparently satisfied, she swept a hand about the room.
John Sutherland, my several times great-grandfather, came to America from Scotland in 1747 and built his home here in the Tennessee hills.
Malcolm's blood boiled instantly, jerking him into the past. Bloody government, man. I should have wiped out the lot of ye that day at Dunrobin Castle. Never mind, Lady Sutherland was sympathetic to the Jacobites. The red haze that blinded him at the mention of the clan which had all but wiped out his troops at the Little Ferry lifted at the thoughts of the elegant Lady Sutherland.
And he spent many years perfecting this new whisky which he felt was the equal to any Scotch he'd ever tasted.
"Loss, a corn whisky canny match a good Scotch," he scoffed, struggling to pull his mind into the present.
I've been told that by visitors before, and they left with their opinions quite changed,
Alison retorted, a pleasant, bantering look on her face. Malcolm warmed to her challenge, enjoying himself despite the fact she was a despised Sutherland. He puffed himself up, preparing to defend the very livelihood of his clan, certain a drink made from the fermenting of corn could never compare to the usquebaugh his father and fathers before him spent their entire lives creating. The door behind Alison blasted open. The older man Malcolm had seen her talking to earlier burst through, bringing the odour of smoke with him. "Miss Sutherland, the fire at the ricks is spread." Alison whipped around at the crash of the door behind her. Bart barreled through, pulling up short. "I've sent for the fire trucks," he wheezed, age taking its toll on him as much as the smoke. Her attention pulled instantly from the intriguing Scotsman. She bolted past Bart and into the small, bricked courtyard. The neat square of stacked lumber, specially cut and dried to become the charcoal they'd filter the whisky through during the process, spread haphazardly to one side of the small clearing just beyond the storage shed, charring the grass and stretching vibrant fingers of flame toward the drying platform. Men wrestled with long hoses, wetting as much of the fire as they could, with water from spigots at 3 of the corners of the blaze. A 4th hose and spigot straggled in a useless black line in the grass, scarcely visible against the orange-red flames. A low wailing sound filled every corner of the hollow, warning of the spreading fire. Shrill blasts from the fire trucks that couldn't be too far away pierced the clamour. Alison darted toward the blaze, barely noticing the man following close at her heels.
"The grass!"
she shouted, garnering the men's attention.
"Wet the grass around the shed!"
She coughed, covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve as smoke drifted over her. Her eyes watered and her throat burned. The men pivoted, changing the angle of the water spray, denying the flames access to the delicate new grass and shed beyond. Fingers of fire flickered away from the water, seeking a better source of fuel. 3 fire trucks screamed down the narrow road, halting next to 2 hydrants. Firemen jumped free, attaching their hoses quickly as others raced across the road, unfolding the flat canvas tubes as they went. A shout went up and the floodgates opened, spewing forth a roar of water that took 2 men to control. They advanced on the fire, forcing it to retreat before them.
"Please don't soak the pyre,"
Alison pleaded with the chief.
"We need that charcoal. Just help us keep it in check."
With an understanding nod, he shouted instructions to his men. Within a few minutes, the fire was once again contained on the ricks, the burning wood glowing from gold to ruby red, pulsing with life.
"What happened?"
she demanded, pulling Bart next to her and the chief, stepping a few feet away from the pall of smoke. Bart wiped his forehead with a handkerchief before shoving it into a pocket, his hand trembling noticeably. "It shot toward the sheds, as though someone threw gas in it," he marvelled. "I was closest, and turned on the spigot, but it was dry." Alison glanced at him sharply.
"Dry? Was it not checked before you lit the fire?"
He scowled. "Yes, of course it was. It worked earlier. I checked it first thing this morning." She turned to the fire chief.
"Thank you for your quick response. Though the fire didn't threaten the distillery, there is a lot of money tied up in the ricks drying in the shed."
The chief nodded. "We'll stick around until your boys put out the fire. Then I'll poke around and see if I can find out what happened." His eyes were kind. "Don't worry. I know this is a tough time for you."
A fire is tough, no matter.
She allowed, deflecting his condolence as her chest tightened. She swallowed back her grief. It didn't help to wonder what her grandfather would have done to prevent the fire. He was gone, and everything was up to her now. "Is there aught I can do to help?" a voice with a heavy Scottish brogue asked.
Darn, I forgot about the tourist.
She glanced over her shoulder, forcing a calm smile onto her face.
No, but thank you. Please keep away from the fire and those men watching it.
His eyebrows rose. "The lads are making quick work of it. Why do you not want them to put it out completely? If you didn't smoke the barley yourself, why do you have all this wood?" She started to tell him to please come back another day. It had been a difficult week, and the last thing she needed was an inquisitive tourist to deal with. She suspected firing the master distiller had been a knee-jerk reaction to his arrogant, condescending remarks to her when she'd arrived 4 days ago, heartbroken over her grandfather's death. But she was the distillery's owner now, and if she decided to stay and run the place, it would be on her terms, not under the thumb of a man's crass insolence, no matter his expertise. She had a lot on her plate. Replacing the master distiller only one of the complexities ahead of her, but a nagging sensation urged her to check the entire distillery, top to bottom, and a tour seemed a brilliant way to get it done while attracting the least notice. Chapter 4. Alison jerked a thumb toward the distillery.
Come on, let's get out of everyone's way.
As the Scotsman moved toward the walkway, Alison inclined her head to the fire chief.
I'm going to check out the rest of the distillery and keep this one out of the way,
she added, with a quick nod to her kilt-clad guest. The chief quirked an eyebrow. "Where'd he come from? Some reenactment around here I don't know about?" She shot Malcolm a sweet smile.
No, he says this is what he always wears,
she murmured, accepting the chief's grunt of surprise as an echo of her own bland incredulity. Any other day, and she and the workers would enjoy a short laugh at the Scotsman's peculiar dress, but the events of the previous week didn't inspire her to hilarity today, and there was something about his broad, muscular shoulders, the way his long stride, albeit from beneath a kilt, stalked across the ground, and somewhat unkempt shoulder-length dark hair framing his stern face, that scarcely invited open criticism.
Where is he from, anyway?
She didn't have time to ponder the question as she caught a quizzical look from Malcolm. She motioned for him to follow her, leading him away from the fire and toward the distillery. Halting on a narrow footbridge spanning a sparkling stream, she watched fish swarm to their shadow, and she bit back a smile of remembrance of feeding the fish from her lunch as she visited her grandfather at the distillery. Apparently, someone still did.
A bit out of normal, since I would usually start a tour by the store. But this is as good a place as any with a fireman at the ricks.
She waved at the area they'd just left. "Ricks?" Malcolm queried. His eyes narrowed, puzzled.
The ricks are the stacks of wood currently being consumed by the fire. One of the requirements to be classified as a Tennessee whiskey is to filter the whiskey through the charcoal. I'm still hoping to get charcoal from this fire, not ashes.
"The other requirement was to use corn, aye?"
Yes, though we use rye and malt barley as well.
She indicated the crystal-clear water beneath their feet.
And to make good whiskey, you must have good water. This comes from the springs just up the hill.
Malcolm nodded. "Aye, good water is very important." Alison nodded.
Ours is filtered naturally underground through a limestone cavern, which removes all the nasties like sulfur and iron. It is very pure. We pipe it in directly from the spring.
She pivoted on her heel, her soft-soled shoes thudding gently on the worn wood of the bridge. Swinging her head side to side, She looked left, then right to check for traffic, before hurrying across the narrow road, the Scotsman following. A small white form launched itself from the small shack at the gate to the distillery property, and Alison crouched, catching the dog as his furry body hurtled into her arms. With laughing protest, she set him down, averting her face from the majority of his frantic licks. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand as she stood. A stout man in a security guard uniform stepped from the shack. "I didn't think you'd be bringing tourists across today," he challenged, with a dark look at the man behind her. Malcolm halted, pulling back as if uncertain. "She offered," he murmured.
I need to do a walkthrough anyway, Dennis. He isn't imposing.
The guard opened the gate to the close-cropped yard around the distillery. "Any idea why the fire got out of control?" he added, as Malcolm and Alison passed through.
Not yet. And please keep Fergus here a bit longer if you don't mind. He's a West Highland white terrier, not grey.
Dennis grinned, tilting his head at the arc of water spray over the rapidly dying fire amid a pile of greying ashes and coal. "He'd love to play in it, wouldn't he?" Alison shot him a warning look.
Keep the gate shut. Fergus, wait here,
she added, with a wave of her palm in front of the terrier's face. Fergus leapt up, licking her fingers before she could pull him back. She wiped her hand down her slacks and led Malcolm through the gate, shutting it firmly behind them. Fergus barked an unhappy commentary, his furry white front feet on the lowest board of the rail fence, then plopped to the ground, muzzle on his paws as he watched them enter the distillery. The aroma of fermenting grains filled Malcolm's nostrils, familiar yet different, as the odour of corn overpowered the sweeter scent of malted barley. He halted inside the doorway and drew a bracing breath. His eyes closed, and a smile played about his lips.
Like it?
His guide asked, a suggestion of laughter in her voice. Malcolm opened his eyes, a hint of embarrassment heating his neck. "Aye, my da and his before him for generations distilled whiskey. I remember it well." Alison tilted her head.
How long since you've been there?
"More than 200 years. A very long time." He jerked his chin at the large pots just beyond the safety railing. "Tell me about this corn whiskey of yours." His guide's attention diverted away.
This is where we cook the grains. We eat the water from the spring, add the grains, and cook them.
She sent a brief smile to a man studying the dials on the enormous pots. He responded with a short nod before returning to his job.
From here, we send the cooked mash to the fermenters upstairs.
She motioned to the 2-story stainless steel tubs behind them. "What is the sugary liquid we get from cooking the barley?" His granddad's words floated through his mind. Malcolm shook his head at the clarity of the memory. The walls wavered around him, and his granddad's voice faded. He was surrounded by stainless steel and fermenting corn once again.
Mind your step on the stairs. They are steep,
Alison instructed as she led the way. Appreciation for the easy swing of her hips jerked Malcolm firmly into the present, and he followed her up the steps.
Here we add the yeast to the mash.
"What?" His granddad's voice echoed counterpoint to Alison's lecture.
And allow it to ferment for 3 to 5 days. It is transferred to the large vat in the corner, where it is stirred before sending it to the still. At this point, it contains 6 to 7% alcohol, and we call it distiller's beer.
"Wash."
I beg your pardon?
Malcolm took a deep breath to dispel his granddad's memory. "We call it wash, though it smells a lot like crude beer." He forced his lips to twist in a ghost of a smile, but he saw the concern on Alison's face. This isn't working, Soni. As alive as you've made me, memories still haunt me, and try as I might, I can't hide it.
Are you certain you're okay?
Alison asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. At his nod, she drew back, glancing at her palm as she did. Her face blanched, and Malcolm followed her horrified gaze as she stared at the dark red stain on her fingers. Blood. In an instant it faded, but Alison turned wide eyes to his.
You're hurt.
Malcolm rubbed the ache in his chest with the heel of his hand. Oh, 'tis an old wound. Strange for you to notice. She glanced back at her hand, the stain gone as though it never existed. She blinked.
Something just happened,
she murmured, her confusion clear. Below, the distillery door opened and closed, and feet pounded up the stairs, the sound on the metal grating rolling like the burst of mortars. Malcolm gripped the lapel of his jacket and braced himself against the smooth wall of the fermenter behind him as reality faded and the agonized cries of wounded men pounded in his ears. Chapter 5.
Robert!
Alison shouted as the man's head cleared the opening in the stairwell.
Help me! I think he's injured.
Tasseled loafers squeaking on the rubber mat spread on the metal grate floor. Robert was just in time to catch the Scotsman as he backed against one of the fermenters and slid to the floor in a heap of green and blue blood. Alison knelt beside him, the back of her hand against his forehead, checking for fever. A light sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, but his skin was cool to her touch. Her fingertips trailed down his lightly stubbled cheek with a decided lack of professional distance. Shaking off unexpected reluctance, Alison drew her hand away. His eyelids blinked rapidly several times, then jerked open, his amber gaze connecting to hers with shocking force. She shivered. "We should get him outside," Robert said, tugging at the tourist's sleeve.
Wait, I don't think he's sick. Give him a moment.
"Nay, I'm no ill."
What happened?
"'Tis close in here," he answered, though his soft words hinted at something more. He was afraid. Of what? "Like I said, let's get him outside," Robert insisted, rousing Malcolm with a clip to his elbow. "Come on now, to your feet." Alison caught Malcolm's dark look and placed a restraining hand on Robert's arm.
Don't push him. He can get up on his own.
Malcolm rolled to his feet, bracing a palm against the fermenter as he rose. "Thank ye. I'll be fine now." She judged him through narrowed eyes, a hand on her hip.
I think Robert is right. It gets very hot in here no matter the season, and I'd feel better if you were on solid ground, not this metal grating.
She nodded to the man beside her.
This is my cousin Robert. Robert, meet Malcolm.
Giving the younger man a wary look, he nodded. "Pleased to meet you." Malcolm jerked his chin toward the far door. "Might we go that way?" he asked, turning his attention back to Alison.
Well, it's really no further, and the steps aren't so steep,
she argued with Robert's disagreeing look.
Please tell me if you feel faint again.
Alison allowed him a brief, wide-eyed look at the tall column still before urging him on, and a quick peek inside an empty filtering tank, its stainless steel sides gleaming from a recent scrubbing.
We filter the whiskey through 13 feet of charcoal before we barrel it to remove any impurities that might linger after the second distillation. That's where the charcoal from the burn across the street will go, once it's cooled and dried.
Malcolm nodded, interest clear on his face, contradicting the fact he'd sprawled at her feet only minutes earlier. She gripped the handle to the door that led outside.
More steps, but they aren't so steep,
she assured the Scotsman, pleased to note the colour in his cheeks had returned. Her hand fisted at the memory of the red stain after she'd touched him.
Odd that I know what I saw. But why did it disappear?
Are you sure he's okay? Robert hissed at her as he stepped through the doorway. Allison peered past him to the tourist.
He seems steady enough. And he's a tourist, not my patient.
Cut the tour short. We need to talk, Robert demanded.
I'm doing a walkthrough, not a tour,
she replied, her temper beginning to slip a notch at Robert's tone. Whatever. Get rid of the tourist. Malcolm gripped the metal railing as he descended the stairs. The edges of his kilt flipped upward in the playful breeze, and he turned his face into the freshness as his gaze drifted about the small yard. Several vehicles of varying age, though most had seen better days, rimmed the paved area adjacent to the brick-wall distillery. A white truck with no markings drove from behind a nearby single-story building and rattled slowly up the hill behind the distillery. Allison's and Robert's voices fluttered behind him, indistinct as a murmur on the breeze. Malcolm paid little attention to the pair, drawn to the sights before him. In his mind's eye, the vehicles faded, replaced by the strong brace of draft horses that pulled the wagon laden with his father's barrelled whisky to the dock for shipment. On the surrounding hillsides, he imagined low buildings stacked floor to ceiling with barrels of maturing whisky, the fiery liquid breathing in and out of the sturdy wood with the changing seasons, gaining flavour and colour as the years passed. And if he took a deep breath and reached deep enough inside himself, he could almost recall the tang of sea air mingling with the honey and cream, faintly salty and spicy notes of fine Sinclair whisky.
I'm sorry, do you mind if we wrap up the tour?
Allison interrupted his contemplations, and he startled, a bit sheepish. Aye, might I try a wee taste before I go? He asked. He didn't really know what else to do. If his act of valour had been to save the distillery from the fire, he couldn't see how he could have done better than the men with the huge hoses and specially equipped trucks. And the memories that continued to catch him off guard and toss him back in the midst of those 2 ominous days in April, nearly 300 years ago, left him rattled as always, blinding him to any role as rescuer. He caught a scowl of indecision on his guide's face.
I signed you in for the tour, but I didn't check your ID.
My what? He asked, uncertain what his ID was, or why it should be checked.
To be sure you're over 21. We can't serve whiskey to anyone younger than 21.
A genuine grin widened across his face. Lass, I'm much older than 21. She tilted her head.
You don't look very old. More worn.
Interesting you should say that. I often feel worn. Allison's gaze met his with sympathy, and he warmed to her notice, reluctant to look away. Oh, for crying out loud, Robert complained, clattering down the steps behind them. Malcolm glanced up sharply, but the rumbling footsteps did not echo in the open air as it had inside the building, and though his heart rate doubled, it settled quickly, keeping the terrors at bay.
Don't rush, Robert,
Allison chided, cutting him a severe look. A breeze cooled the sweat on Malcolm's brow, betraying his jolt of fear a moment earlier. He dragged the ragged sleeve of his jacket across his forehead as frustration crept in. When does this end, Soni? How do I face my fears and end this? I can't endure this much longer. After nearly 3 centuries, I had hoped I'd paid for my sins. I didn't want this burden. I want peace. Give him a sip and send him on his way, Robert insisted, hands on his hips, as he turned his displeasure from Allison to Malcolm.
It isn't legal,
she replied, holding her ground. How old are you? Robert demanded, confronting Malcolm. I was 24. His voice trailed off. 270 years ago. Good enough, Robert declared, clapping Malcolm heartily on his shoulder.
No, it's not.
Allison argued, but her words fell on deaf ears as Robert stared at his palm. Red, blood. Pain shot across Malcolm's chest, and he gripped the ancient wound. A moan slid from his lips before he could stop it. Alarm flashed across Allison's face.
Can you make it over there?
She asked Malcolm, her voice low with concern. Malcolm glanced at the small structure she indicated, perhaps 30 yards distant. He nodded.
Good. It's private there.
She gripped his coat sleeve as though she expected him to collapse at any moment and led him to the single-room building. Robert followed, closing the door behind them. He flopped onto a tall chair at the bar, splaying his fingers on the polished surface as he stared at his palm. I need a drink. Chapter 6. Liquid as cool as the stream from which it came, and fiery as the spirit it had become, slid down his throat. Hints of vanilla and spice, mellowed with a smoky background, teased his tongue. Malcolm hummed with pleasure. The flavour, though lacking the faintly salty notes he was accustomed to, was rich, supple, full-bodied with a spicy finish, perhaps as smooth as the finest Scotch his granda had jealously guarded in his private collection. "Did you check his ID?" he asked, levelling the far rim of his glass toward the young man at the bar.
This is medicinal,
Allison demurred, pouring herself another shot. She nursed it, staring into the rich amber depths. After a few moments, she shifted her gaze to his.
Malcolm, I need to know what happened.
Could you be more specific, lass? She arched an eyebrow at his challenge.
All right. Why did Robert and I get blood on our hands when we touched you, and why is it gone now?
Ugh, I was afraid that was what you meant. Are you sure you want the answer? Robert swiveled in his chair a bit awkwardly, proving himself a lightweight after a single shot of the whiskey. Tell her what happened, Scott. Malcolm's lip curled with distaste for the young man's high-handed ways. You will not like it, so hie yourself back inside your glass and wait until you're called. I don't have to take that from you, Robert sneered. Calm settled over Malcolm, and he narrowed his gaze. Nay, you dinna. The veiled invitation and threat pierced the cloud round Robert's deplorable manners, and he scooted his buttocks back inside the safety of his chair. Malcolm returned his attention to the woman on the other side of the small, circular table. I dinna know what you will think, but in a few hours it will nae matter, so I'll tell you straight.
What do you mean it won't matter in a few hours?
Her eyes widened with alarm.
Are you in league with Sandy?
Her question took Malcolm aback. Who is Sandy?
The master distiller I fired a couple of days ago.
Malcolm shook his head. Nay, I only arrived this morning. I will be gone in a few hours at the most, 'tis all I meant. Relaxing with an exhale of breath, Allison sank back in her seat.
You were going to explain about the stain.
Malcolm leaned his forearms on the table, his glass cradled between his fingers, the bottom glinting copper and gold with the scant remains of the whiskey. How well do you know your Scottish history? Allison shrugged.
My grandfather was a grand one for telling stories, and I loved them as a child. I had little time for them, though, as I got older.
Do you remember earlier today when I told you the Sinclairs and Sutherlands often feuded? She smiled.
Yes, I remember.
He sighed. That was the easy part of the explanation. Here's the hard part. When I was a young man, England and Scotland struggled for sovereignty. Allison's mouth opened, question furrowing her brow. Malcolm raised a hand to stop her words. I told you this was the hard part. A German monarch sat on the throne of England, and that of Scotland as well. Prince Charles, rightful heir to Scotland's crown, made a bid to reclaim the throne, and in 1745 he arrived on Scotland's shores and changed history. The scrape of a chair on the wooden floor snatched Malcolm's notice as Robert, his eyes now clear and curious, settled next to him. My grandfather told stories of the 45, he breathed, animosity replaced with attentiveness. Go on. Malcolm rolled his glass between his fingers. I was with the Earl of Cromartie's forces in the spring of 46. He ignored Alison's gasp. We took Dunrobin Castle from the Earl of Sutherland, then left to join Prince Charles's forces at Inverness. Culloden, Robert breathed. The whispered word sent Malcolm back in time. Bitterly cold air filled Malcolm's nostrils. Snow stung his cheeks and hands, and his feet froze in boots too worn to keep out the cold. The crunch of frosty ground rustled beneath tramping feet. Popping sounds filled the air, cries of surprise and pain mingling with shouts of anger. Ahead of him loomed the shore of the loch, edged with ice and the promise of death. Behind him rifles barked and swords whistled their battle song. Hands pushed at him as men rushed past, flinging themselves into the water. Something warm and furry leapt into his lap, and a low-pitched whine filled his ears. Malcolm blinked and met the liquid gaze of Alison's wee dog. Dark brown eyes, fringed with unruly tufts of white fur, stared at him. Hesitantly, Malcolm dragged a hand over the hard dome of the shaggy head. The wiry hair smoothed beneath his fingers, and he stroked the head again. Slowly, his breathing returned to normal, as his hand continued the repetitive, soothing rhythm. The dog licked Malcolm's hand once, then settled across Malcolm's kilted legs with a sigh. Alison closed the door the dog had pushed open, and Robert poured Malcolm another shot of whiskey. Fergus licked at a spilled drop. Malcolm continued. On the way, our troops were attacked by Sutherlands. Most of the officers were captured. The soldiers were either killed or driven into Loch Fleet, where they drowned.
And you?
Alison asked, keeping a skittish distance from Malcolm's seat. I grew up swimming in the coldest waters Scotland can boast. It nearly killed me to remain in the loch long enough for the government men to give up, assuming those of us still in the water were as good as dead. But I escaped and continued on to Inverness, where I met up with a group of Frasers and a campfire. Did you fight at Culloden? Robert asked, eyes wide with wonder at Malcolm's tale. Alison flung her hands into the air.
Oh, come on, Robert. Don't tell me you believe you fought in a war that was, 200 years ago?
270, actually, Malcolm corrected. The others ignored him. And why am I the one defending him? Robert challenged. You always were the one to believe every sad story you heard.
I've become cynical.
She drawled, crossing her arms over her chest.
And I don't believe in ghosts.
Robert blinked. Yes, that's what he is, isn't it? He turned back to Malcolm. Why are you here? Malcolm recalled Soni's soft words. To do a heroic deed and say my piece with Prince Charlie. Alison and Robert stared at him, their jaws slack. And to face my fears and be delivered from my memories. Chapter 7. A heroic act? Robert scoffed.
Face your fears?
Alison added, waving a hand at Robert to shush him.
If you're already dead.
And the skepticism on her face indicated she found that hard to believe.
Then what do you fear?
Malcolm's fingers clenched tight in Fergus's fur. The dog licked his hand and wagged his stubby tail. The tension building between Malcolm's shoulders eased, and he managed a half smile. "The day after I escaped the loch, I was killed by a bayonet thrust to my chest. That's where the red stain on your hands comes from." Alison and Robert each looked instantly at their palms. There was nothing.
So what's this heroic act you're supposed to perform?
Malcolm shook his head. "I dinna know. Since I am here, my task must be to protect ye." Alison frowned.
The only trouble I've had since you arrived is the rick fire getting out of control. But you didn't stop that.
"Nay," Malcolm agreed. "I couldn't do better than the lads who came in the big trucks."
Is fire something you fear?
"Nay, I dinna fear fire." He recalled the warmth of the Fraser campfire that had saved his life.
Other than the memories that seem to keep sucking you down whenever I mention my name or there's loud noises, what do you fear?
His face whitened as he felt compelled to answer. "Water." Robert laughed. "Well, Alison has always gone on about how you have to have perfect water to make good whiskey, so you come to the right place to face that fear." Alison sent him an exasperated look.
I don't think our shallow creek is a thing to be feared.
"It is if someone tampers with the springs," Robert shot back, a smug grin on his face. Breath flew from her lungs as though she'd been punched in the gut, hard. Her fingers reached for the back of the chair before her, and she gripped it between nerveless fingers in support for her wobbly legs. Snapshots of the springs flashed through her mind, recalling details of the security precautions and her grandfather's words as he explained it to her.
Grandfather had the springs fenced in years ago. It's locked up.
"But he never put security cameras up, did he?"
Whoever hikes up there, it's not that easy to get to.
"If someone wished to harm the distillery, they would find a way, lass," Malcolm said. The acid in the back of her throat told her Malcolm was right. She eyed his well over 6-foot frame sprawled in the chair, her dog in his lap.
Why should I not think you created the problem instead of coming to fix it?
"Ye dinna know me," Malcolm agreed, "but I am more than willing to help ye, even if ye are a Sutherland." The intimate quirk of his lips reminded her of his reaction to her mention of the distillery name.
He didn't know where he was. It doesn't mean I think he is a ghost, no matter what my nerdy cousin wants to believe, but it does mean he isn't likely to have caused harm.
She took a deep breath, energized.
Let's check it out.
They exited through the rear door of the building only a few yards from the warehouse. Once inside, she led them a winding course across the wide aisles of the building and out a side door where 2 all-terrain vehicles loitered. Jumping in the driver's seat of one, she reached for the start button. "How come you always get to drive?" Robert groused, as he slouched into the passenger seat, propping his feet on the dash. Alison ignored Robert and glanced over her shoulder to make certain the Scotsman was settled in the back. He grasped one of the overhead roll bars, Fergus beside him, the dog's nubby tail wagging excitedly. Punching the button beneath her fingertip, she drowned out Robert's complaints as the ATV roared to life. They left the sturdy vehicle a few minutes later at the bottom of the hill, where the rocky, rutted trail ended and the steep footpath began. Last fall's leaves were a slippery mess, and Robert roundedly cursed the smooth soles on his loafers as he grabbed a slender sapling to keep from falling. He shuffled upright and disdainfully dusted bark and debris from his palms.
Are you going to make it?
Alison asked. He answered her with a glare. She shrugged. With a quick glance at Malcolm, who seemed unfazed by the hike before them, she set off up the trail, marked only by the faded blaze of orange paint on trees and rocks along the way. Mindful of the warming weather, she kept her hands off the sun-kissed massive rocks that cropped up beside the path, eyeing the area for snakes as they trudged on. Though, from the racket Robert was making, any snake with an iota of self-preservation would be long gone from the region. Malcolm paced alongside, his footsteps firm in the leaves. She saw him glance at Fergus, who darted through the leaves, nose to the ground, clearly delighted by the smells in the damp earth.
He calms you, doesn't he?
She asked, brushing a green, leaf-tipped limb away. Aye, 'tis the slow, repetitive movement, I believe, he replied. Robbie.
Who is Robbie?
She prodded when he didn't continue. Another ghost at the moor, a lad no more than 10 summers who'd followed his da from home. He and his dog were hit by shrapnel and counted among the dead that day. A deep chill that had nothing to do with the way the spring leaves filtered the warmth of the sun flashed through her veins.
How can he make it sound so real?
Dauphin, his dog, would sometimes sit with me when my memories were too intense, seemed to know it helped. He shot her a sheepish look. The lads didn't like being around me when the nightmares struck.
Lads?
Ghosts. There were 79 of us.
Were?
Aye. A wee witch named Soni has offered us the chance to end our days of haunting. Several have gone on, accomplished their deed.
Do you think you will do yours?
She asked, in spite of her reservations. I dinna know. Sometimes things are so dim, as if nothing matters but the terrible things in my head, he sighed. Mayhap we will get this settled, so ye and young Robert back there can live your lives without threat to the distillery. That would be an accomplishment, aye. Alison stole a look over her shoulder.
You have no idea.
Robert slipped on the leaves again and fell forward, catching himself on his hands before he sprawled in the rich organic mess. She hid a smile at his disgust as he wiped his palms down his once immaculate slacks.
He doesn't like to be dirty.
She excused him to the Scotsman. He's a wee bit disgruntled.
Perhaps more than just disgruntled. Our grandfather owned this distillery. My father, his partner, died several years ago. I pretty much grew up here, though I've been away at school for several years.
The muscles in her face softened, and warmth of childhood memories lit her heart.
I knew every inch of this place, from the mash tubs to the warehouses. Robert visited occasionally, but preferred grandfather's office and all the awards on the walls. Then grandfather died and left the distillery to me. I think Robert was rather put out.
Put out?
Upset. This place is in my blood. Robert doesn't understand it like I do. But I think he wanted to be in charge. I'm thinking about offering to let him buy in. It will make him angry that I don't offer the partnership freely. But he needs to have a stake in it, not just fancy himself sitting at grandfather's desk ordering people around.
He'd offer him a place shoveling coal and the opportunity to work his way up from there, Malcolm observed dryly.
I'd love to see that.
She halted, slanting her sturdy tennis shoes sideways on the path to keep from sliding backward. She held up a hand to forestall questions and turned her face up the trail, listening intently.
Hear the waterfall?
The two men shifted their feet for purchase in the brittle leaves. Just up ahead, aye, Malcolm replied. She nodded.
Come on, not much further.
Her gaze fell to Robert as he clutched the branch of a tree for support.
We can come back for you if you like to wait for us.
He snorted, a gasp mingled with a wheeze as he caught his breath. I'll be right behind you. Tossing Malcolm a challenging grin, Alison bolted up the path, shoving limbs aside. Malcolm matched her stride for stride, his gait not wavering.
Ghost or not, he's in shape.
But something bothered her about the frayed edges to his jacket and the rags wrapped about the tops of his boots that seemed clean enough, but stained, as though they didn't see a washing machine very often. She didn't have time to process that thought as the waterfall loomed before them. The chain-link fence surrounding the cinder-block building encasing the springs less than 100 yards upstream. She halted, hands on her hips, staring at the precautions her grandfather had considered adequate to protect the precious water flowing to the distillery at the foot of the mountain. "Looks formidable, aye." The Scotsman's voice at her shoulder rose above the noise of the water.
I don't know if we can get close enough to check the block building. There are no pumps to move the water. It all flows by gravity down the hill, so we rarely have anyone traipse up here to check anything.
She glanced at the water oozing about her feet.
We've had a wet spring and the ground is really saturated.
A touch to her shoulder. "Your wee cousin found a path." Her gaze flew down the length of Malcolm's arm to where he pointed. An oak tree partially hid Robert, his back to them, neck bent as he studied something in his hands. Before Alison could call out, Fergus bounded up the hill, leaves scattering in his wake, and leapt against Robert's leg. Startled, Robert's arms windmilled as he clutched at the air. He landed on the seat of his pants with a soft thud. He scrambled to his knees, palms frantically patting the wet leaves. "Help me!" he screamed as he spun about, flinging water and wet leaves like a madman. Alison strode to his side, dodging the airborne debris. She nudged his backside with her shoe.
Get up. A little mud isn't going to kill you.
His panicked face, ghastly white, alarmed her.
What's wrong, Robert?
"I lost it." He returned to his wild search of the ground.
Stop. Just stop. Tell me what happened. You're filthy.
He pounced on something in the leaves and clutched it to his chest. Alison braced one fist on her hip, extending her other hand expectantly.
Give it here.
"No." His voice lacked conviction, but he didn't budge. Malcolm reached for the article hidden in Robert's hands. Robert scooted backward, slapping at Malcolm's hand. With a swift move, Malcolm snatched the smooth glass cylinder from the younger man's grasp. Robert bolted to his feet, grabbing Malcolm's jacket, battering his arm in protest. Malcolm paused. "Do you wish to fight me, lad? You canna hurt me, and I dinna wish to harm ye." "Give that back!" Robert's face took on a mulish expression. His eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. Turning the vial over in his hand, Malcolm shook his head. "I think your cousin should see it first." Robert threw a half-hearted punch that slid through the air and connected with nothing. He sank back to the ground, defeated, uncaring of the state of his once pristine clothing. Malcolm handed the glass tube to Alison. She took it hesitantly, giving Malcolm a questioning look. The top was sealed with a rubber stopper. She waffled the cylinder from side to side. The liquid was clear, giving her no clue to its identity. Her heart thudded heavily in apprehension.
Tell me what this is, Robert,
she commanded in a firm, quiet voice. Robert shrugged, clearly unwilling to confess. Malcolm sighed and grasped the young man by his shoulder and hauled him to his feet. Alison's desire to protect her cousin fled, and for an instant she wished the braw Scotsman would make a fist and knock some sense into the snivelling worm who wouldn't look her in the eye.
The liquid. What was it?
"I don't know."
Okay, let's make this easy for you. What does it do, and where did you get it?
"That's 2 questions at once, lass. It may be too much for him as rattled as he is," Malcolm observed pityingly. "It would contaminate the water," Robert sulked, his gaze still glued to the ground.
The water to the distillery?
Alison gasped, the air knocked from her lungs in disbelief. Robert hesitated, then nodded. "Where did ye get it?" Malcolm demanded. Several long, silent moments passed. Alison considered asking Malcolm to give Robert a wee incentive to speak. Robert wiped his nose on the back of his sleeve and shrugged. Sandy, he gave it to me. Alison couldn't speak. It was unthinkable. Who is Sandy? Malcolm asked.
He's our master distiller.
I wasn't going through with it, Robert protested. Anger roared to life inside Alison. She fisted her hands and took a step toward her treacherous cousin. He shrank back, still in Malcolm's grip.
You little double-crossing bag of snot. What do you mean not go through with it? You brought this up here, dropped it on the edge of the creek.
And got it back. You saw me. I decided not to do it, he screeched at her. I want to run the distillery, not ruin it.
Does Sandy want to ruin it?
Robert cut his eyes away from her angry gaze. He already is. Chapter 8. Anger at Robert's answer spiraled through Malcolm. Something more important than a heroic deed fueled his desire to get a complete answer. Alison's livelihood was at stake, and that meant more to him than he thought possible. What is your man doing? He gave Robert a wee shake to help coax an admission from him. Robert's head snapped back on his neck. Robert grabbed at Malcolm's hand. All right, just make him stop, he implored, with a glance at Alison. Malcolm hissed through his teeth and released the rightly named bag of snot. Robert staggered, then righted himself, jerking his jacket lapels to straighten it across his shoulders. Sandy has been shuffling numbers for some time now. You know, so many barrels in the warehouse, but a few extra here and there for private sale. Alison's eyebrows arched upward.
I suppose those private sales never made it to the ledger.
No, but I found it. Robert's tone bordered on boastful. Malcolm sent him a severe look, and he crumpled. Sandy was going to cut me in, but then Grandpa died, and Sandy said he'd still get me my share when I was a director. You know, under the table. He slid Alison a resentful look. But then Grandpa left it all to you. I got nothing. Sandy said you didn't really want it, but when he argued with you, you fired him, and we got nothing. Malcolm risked a look at Alison. Twin spots of colour flashed high on her cheeks, her skin deathly white. Her eyes flashed.
He told me I didn't have the guts or experience to run the distillery. I thought that rather presumptuous of him, seeing as I pretty much grew up here and can tell the state of whiskey with my eyes closed. But his arrogance sealed the deal. His attitude has no place here.
Muscles worked in her jaw as she clenched her teeth and squared her shoulders. That's my girl, Malcolm approved, then checked. My girl? Warmth stole through him, and he hazarded a smile. Even though she was a Sutherland, she had spunk, and had she been born in a different century, he might have risked his father's wrath to court her. Had he met her in different circumstances, he would certainly risk it. As it was, Soni and fate had other ideas. The taste in his mouth turned sour. Alison narrowed her eyes at Robert.
So you plan to poison the water? We would lose countless barrels, hundreds of thousands of dollars, perhaps forcing us to close the distillery. Thankfully, nothing is processed without tasting it. Your stunt would have destroyed our inventory and taken us years to recover.
It wasn't a stunt, Robert protested. An entire batch of whiskey that tasted off would have proved to everyone you didn't have what it takes to run the distillery. It would have come to me, he frowned. But I told you, I decided not to go through with it. His sulky voice returned. Long shadows fell across Alison's face, lining it with disbelief, weariness, and despair. Something pulled at Malcolm's heart, something tender and caring. She deserved to be looked after, and he was the Scotsman to do it. Thus, the afternoon is passing. We should get off this mountain before dark. See about getting that liquid investigated. For a moment he thought she hadn't heard him, but then she flinched and inhaled a deep breath. She stared for a long moment at the vial in her hand before slipping it into her shirt pocket.
I doubt it's poisonous. Iron or sulfur would destroy the flavor of the whiskey without causing lasting harm. There's no law against carrying liquid iron in a test tube.
Nay, though putting it in the distillery's water source would be a dastardly deed, worthy of punishment, Malcolm countered. Robert grimaced at Malcolm's scowl as he contemplated a suitable penance.
Come on, then. I still have a lot to do.
Giving Robert a stern look, she added,
And you're going to help me.
They made their way down the steep trail, slipping and sliding, and finding the rocks beneath the leaves more than once with their backsides when they lost their footing. Malcolm fared better than the others in his sturdy boots, and he trudged on, keeping Robert always in his sight. Alison's knee twisted beneath her, and she sagged sharply. A quick grab to her elbow steadied her. She flashed Malcolm a grateful look. Take my arm, lass.
I can.
She caught his look.
Thank you.
She amended, wrapping her fingers around his upper arm. Wonder flooded Malcolm as he registered her touch. Since Soni had sent him here, he had known the calming of wee Fergus's touch and the rush of warmth of Alison's hand. Too many years had passed since he'd known aught but the coldness of the moor and the misery of his disturbing thoughts. It was suddenly good to be alive. They reached the four-wheeled vehicle and climbed aboard as before, though Robert slouched in his seat, braced as though he only needed one good dose of courage to leap from the vehicle and take off to parts unknown. Malcolm grasped the overhead bar as Fergus bounded across the back seat with obvious pleasure. Malcolm grinned at the grimy, furry feet and bits of leaf debris stuck to the wee dog's coat. He certainly seemed to relish his romp outdoors. As Alison braked next to the distillery, Robert darted from his seat. He cornered the warehouse and was immediately out of sight. Malcolm leapt to the ground, murderous intent to pound the snivelling worm roaring through him.
Let him go.
You'd let him escape, Malcolm wondered, coming to a halt. After what he did. Almost did, he corrected. She shook her head.
He won't go far. And if he does, good riddance. If I see him again, I'm likely to call the police.
And you should. He nearly cost you dear.
But he is my cousin, and rightfully should have garnered some bit of inheritance from my grandfather. Partnership in the distillery perhaps isn't a good idea, but I'm sure he expected something.
Your cousin almost lost you a year or more of whiskey. You had a reputation, and you would defend him.
For the memories I have, yes. I will not deny his actions, but I will not condemn him either.
Malcolm shook his head. I dinna know what to think, lass. You have an honour many do not. I would have been proud to call you my wife, he meant to say, but it would help no one to voice the heartfelt words. Alison stepped from the vehicle, slowly closing the distance between them.
So, what to do now?
Malcolm cocked his head, questioning. What do you mean, lass? She smiled faintly.
You've done your heroic deed here, saving the distillery's water. So where will you go now?
There was a wistful quality to her voice, and her tiny smile remained. My leaving pleases ye? Malcolm asked, a hollow quality in his chest. Instantly, the smile vanished.
No, of course not.
Something Malcolm could only define as regret touched her face.
I will miss you. I suppose I have gotten used to hearing you call me lass.
Malcolm's composure slipped a notch. The urge to do battle with her deceitful cousin vanished. He stepped toward her, then stopped, one hand to the back of his neck, as he attempted to rub the unfamiliar sensation of confusion and longing. Ridiculous. He was a ghost. Soni had been perfectly clear what his time limits were, but St. Andrew help him, he wanted more. He wanted her. I didn't know what happens next. I had thought I would be snatched up and sent on the next part of my journey once I finished my task, but I didn't know why I'm still here. Curiosity plagued him. How much longer before Soni noticed he'd saved the distillery? Understanding dawned. Except I haven't, he murmured. He straightened, energy sparking through him. I didn't save the distillery. Your bloody cousin dropped the vial. We saw him, and he either didn't get his chance or truly decided not to go through with his act.
More likely, he didn't have the guts to stand up to us and do it anyway. He could have dumped the contents into the water right in front of us. We were too far away to stop him. Though I don't know how he would have ensured it went into the springs instead of flowing away down the creek.
She paused, giving him a thoughtful look.
And you weren't afraid of the water? Don't you have to face your fears?
Malcolm almost laughed, startling himself before the sound was more than a faint rumble in his chest. But the sensation was heady, giving him courage and a strange lightness of heart. Lass, a wee burn canna frighten me. My darkest dreams are of the loch and being unable to reach the surface, as my friends died around me.
Are you truly a ghost?
She asked, wonder in her voice. A dose of reality dampened Malcolm's spirits. His hand drifted upward to finger the hole in his jacket over his chest, the exact spot where his heart lay beating again. He shrugged his left shoulder from the coat, burying the wound. It didn't look so bad. The torn cloth of his shirt sagged downward, covering the hole in his skin, and only minimal blood soaked the fabric. The bayonet had done its damage on the inside. He'd felt it instantly, and the heavy, clenching sensation around his heart as the blade had withdrawn. He'd been dead almost before he'd hit the ground. Alison pointed to the wound as the edges of cloth fluttered in the light evening breeze.
This?
She asked. Malcolm nodded. Aye, an English bayonet pierced my heart, but it took 6 government soldiers that day before I fell. Her gaze jerked to his face, green eyes dark with concern, confusion.
That's not makeup, then?
I didn't make it up, if that's what you mean, he ventured.
And you didn't snap after some traumatic event and wake up convinced you're an 18th century ghost?
I woke after the battle at Culloden and realised I am a ghost.
We'll go with that, then. I don't know how to make myself believe this. I know you've been traumatized. Even Fergus knows that. And you're very kind to help me.
I am honoured to help, lass, bargain or no. Ye are a remarkable woman. There, he'd said something from his heart. Its beat increased, kicking up a happy dance in his chest.
You seem to be the only one who thinks so. Both my cousin and the master distiller want me out of the way.
She gave Malcolm a wondering look.
I really do appreciate your help. I don't know what I would have done had you not stepped in. It is hard to believe Robert would do such a thing. Thank you again for seeing this through with me.
As I am still here, I would help you discover the Stillman's perfidy. How do you wish to start? She frowned.
I'd thought about burning the midnight oil, going over the books to see if I could spot the discrepancies. But my training is as a nurse, not an accountant, and I doubt I'd see it even if the misleading entries were highlighted in bright pink and jumped off the page.
Burning oil. Lass, did your cousin not say the Stillman had been selling barrels of whiskey on the side?
Yes,
She ventured, drawing the word out as though she wasn't quite following him. Burning barrels, whiskey. He already is. I think we should check the storehouses. Urgency built. I think we should check them now. He glanced about, not seeing other buildings that would hold the barrels. In his memory, a white truck trudged up the narrow road behind the distillery. Where are they? He jogged to the back of the building and spotted the track as it wound up the hillside into the forest. There! He pointed up the hill. For an answer, Allison leapt into the cart and cranked it to life. It skidded to a halt beside Malcolm, and he slid into the passenger seat. He pounded the back of the vehicle with a fist. Fergus, up! The dog bounded into the back, pink tongue hanging out the side of his mouth, eager for another ride. Chapter 9. Grim lines of determination showed in the set of her jaw and the grip of her hands on the wheel as she guided the vehicle up the winding hillside. Scarcely wide enough for the white truck Malcolm had seen earlier, the small paved road jutted over the edge of the mountain, growing steeper as they climbed. Malcolm gripped the metal bar near his head as she wheeled the vehicle around another sharp curve, wishing for a sturdy Highland pony between his legs instead of the much-patched slippery seat beneath his buttocks. Water glittered to the left under the fading sunlight. Allison nodded at the small lake.
It's man-made, kind of like a buffer between the warehouses and the distillery, and a good source of water should we ever battle a fire on this side of the street.
Malcolm shuddered, as much from the thought of a fire at the distillery as from the sight of so much water. Fergus licked the back of his neck, and Malcolm gave himself a mental shake to ward off threatening memories as he focused on Allison's next words.
Grandfather said the storehouses were built up here because they would be too protected from the weather down in the hollow, and the whiskey needs the cold and warmth of the seasons for the wood to breathe, letting the whiskey flow in and out for color and flavor.
Judging by her white-knuckled grip on the wheel, Allison was talking more for her benefit than his, for he knew the art of maturing whiskey well. Ours were built on a hillside also, he said. We lived very close to the sea, and the usquebaugh matured with a hint of the salt air in its flavour. She cut him a quick glance, and her grip eased.
I'd forgotten you've a distillery background, too. Would you like that again if you had the chance?
Malcolm considered her question. Aye, 'tis hard work, but there is an artistry about it that resonates in me. 'Tis in my blood, you might say. He grinned. And I dinna mean I overdrink the whiskey. Allison's lips twitched.
No, convincing everyone to drink responsibly is important. But I know how you feel. I left to pursue a nursing career, loving my visits back at the distillery, remembering the days I spent here as a child and older, following the process to its completion. It is quite satisfying to sample that barrel you set aside more than 10 years ago and find it every bit as marvelous as you'd imagined. But when Grandfather died...
When was that?
Not quite a week ago.
Her spine stiffened as she quickly wiped a knuckle across a pale cheek. I'm sorry, lass. My granda was still alive when I left to join the war in support of Prince Charles, but he is many generations gone now. They topped the hill, and Allison manoeuvred the cart next to the first building. Unremarkable, made of metal and wood, and sporting enormous double doors, it and the other 7 like it housed the Sutherland treasure. The setting sun burst orange and gold, gilding the buildings, a declaration of the amber liquid within. Fergus jumped from his perch, nose to the ground as he trotted away, intent on his own business. Malcolm's battle-honed gaze surveyed the area. The white truck sat silently to one side, almost completely hidden behind the farthest storehouse. Silence fell heavily on the ridge, eerily so. A gentle wind swayed the trees on the edge of the cleared space, their branches dipping rhythmically, afternoon sunlight dancing on their leaves.
I think we should check the outside of the buildings first.
She motioned to her right.
You take that side. I'll go this way.
He wanted to tell her to be careful, but she'd already struck off on her own. Shrugging off a sense of unease which prickled the hairs on the back of his neck, he followed the rocky drive to the west side of the warehouses, ears attuned to every sound. The distance between himself and Alison grew, the cart now a small black object huddled in the increasing gloom. He approached the first building and tugged on the door. It creaked but was latched firm. Cautious, he moved to the next warehouse, feeling exposed in the broad track between the buildings. His nerves stretched taut. The ancient wound on his chest ached, and he rubbed it with the heel of his hand. A scream split the air. Malcolm spun about, hands splayed for balance. Something thumped against metal. The close of a truck door. He darted around the building, crouching low. Rounding the corner, he spotted Alison hauled backward as she fought the grip of a sandy-haired man.
"Let me go!"
she shrieked. She collapsed to her knees, slipping from the man's hold. His arms suddenly empty, the man stumbled. Alison pushed off from the ground with a powerful thrust of her legs, arcing back. Her head thudded solidly with the man's nose, and he crumpled where he stood, hands to his face, blood dripping from his chin. Alison whirled about, her foot drawn back to finish the job. Sandy rocked back and forth, moaning miserably, the fight gone from him. Malcolm skidded to a halt, a surprised smile on his face. "Well done for a Sutherland, lass," he approved. "Who is this Amadan who thought he could best ye?"
"This,"
she spat, colouring the word so vividly Malcolm cringed.
"is my ex-master distiller."
"Sandy,"
she
mocked, tossing his brogue back at him. "What had ye stumbled upon?" Malcolm eyed the man as he wiped his bloody nose tenderly with his jacket sleeve. Alison lifted her foot warningly, and Malcolm took pity on the man. "It may be we need to speak with him. Dinna injure him further. I believe the two of us can handle him." She flashed him a grin.
"I like you, Malcolm. Most men would have patted my head and said they'd take over. Nice of you to notice I can handle myself."
"I respect your abilities, though bear with me if I'd rather not see you muss your pretty face."
"Fair enough."
She addressed the man at her feet.
"Sit up. I have some questions for you."
Sandy tilted his head in her direction, cupping his nose in his palm. "It's broken," he protested. Suddenly, his eyes flew open wide, and he scrambled awkwardly to his feet. He managed 2 steps before Alison sent him sprawling with a well-placed kick to the inside of his knee. Sandy groaned, clutching his leg as he rolled about in agony. Alison frowned.
"Oh, be quiet. I didn't kick you hard enough to dislocate it."
"Nay, but you'll have a nice bruise to remember ye by." Malcolm spoke sharply to Sandy. "Tell the lass what she needs to know." "You're gonna get us killed," Sandy snarled, rolling to his feet. He swayed on one leg, the toe of his other boot lightly touching the ground, his knee apparently unable to bear the strain. With a frantic glance over his shoulder, he shoved past Malcolm and Alison and bolted around the corner of the building, his injured leg throwing a hitch in his gait. Malcolm's chin jerked up, wondering what caused the man's panic. Without warning, the rear doors of the white truck exploded outward, releasing a ball of fire that sent shrapnel winging through the air. Malcolm dove for Alison, knocking her to the ground, covering her body with his. Breath he'd not needed in nearly 300 years left his chest in a harsh whoosh. Screams pierced his ears, and the acrid odour of smoke filled his nose, and he was instantly transported to Culloden. The odour of churned moor rose from the ground. Chains rattled as the government army advanced its artillery. Cries of challenge and death shook the air. Barking pierced his thoughts, and he wondered for a startled moment if Robbie and his dog had returned. Something solid landed on his chest and proceeded to wash his face. He raised an arm in protest.
Get up. Don't give up now.
The voice, fiercely demanding, choked. Soft hands cupped the side of his face. With a mighty effort, Malcolm opened his eyes and returned to the present, finding himself on his back. Alison bent over him as she tugged on his jacket, peering at him with urgency and care. Fergus skittered to the side, whining anxiously. Malcolm sat, shaking his head for focus. The heat of the fire from the truck warmed him. They were close, too close. He scrambled to his feet. "We must get the truck away from the whiskey." Alison rose more slowly, her gaze on the red staining her hands.
You're bleeding again.
Malcolm waved her protest away impatiently. "'Twill be gone in a moment, as before. Dinna fash." She looked at him, eyes wide.
No, this time it's real.
His attention jerked to his side as the sting of injury blossomed belatedly. A splintered scrap of wood jutted from a tear in his jacket, and he eyed it in surprise. "By St. Andrew's teeth, that doesn't look good." He fingered it speculatively. Buried deep, it did not budge, and he grimaced at the flash of pain.
Don't touch it. We'll get you to a hospital.
Malcolm blinked at her. "It cannae hurt me, lass," he assured her, "and we need to move the truck before it catches the warehouses on fire." Chapter 10. Torn between two calamities, Alison nodded once, firming her resolve, though hating the fact he'd been injured on her account.
Then let's move the truck.
She had to accept Malcolm's reassurance about his injury, and perhaps accept even the realization that he was, in fact, a ghost. He certainly acted as though the wooden stake protruding from his side was of no consequence, though even seriously injured people could manage miraculous feats under moments of great duress. He grabbed her arm and took off at a rapid pace toward the truck. She gathered her scattered thoughts and followed, towed along in his wake. The rear doors of the truck hung drunkenly open, and flames licked the top of the rear compartment, brilliantly orange and red in the deepening gloom. "How do you start this thing?" Malcolm called as he jumped into the driver's seat. He wriggled once, then slid back to the ground. Grabbing the wooden spike in his side, he wrenched it loose. Alison stared in horrified shock as he tossed it casually to the ground. "'Twas in my way," he grunted, before climbing back inside the vehicle. With no time to argue or think on the consequences of his actions, Alison pushed past him and reached beneath the seat. Her fingers pried the floor mat up, searching for the spare key. It was gone.
Damn! He took the key!
Frustration and anger clogged her throat.
Why, oh why, don't I know how to short-wire a truck?
"Then we'll push it out of the way," Malcolm grunted as he slipped from his seat. Alison's mouth opened to remind him the truck faced away from the building, and they could only push it into the warehouses, since the rear of the truck was ablaze. Before she could stop him from doing the unthinkable, he vanished into the smoke and flames.
No!
She stared after him in disbelief, frozen to the spot. Something in her mind spurred her to action, and she jumped into the cab and shoved the gears into neutral. Nothing happened for a long, agonizing moment, and then the truck began to move. Relief bloomed through her, making her heart dance. He was alive. Making sure the truck was headed in the right direction, Alison leapt to the ground and skittered a few steps away. One of the rear doors of the truck was shut against the flames, and Malcolm pushed against what had to have been white-hot metal. His head drooped between his shoulders, back arched, his legs, corded with straining muscle, showing from beneath his kilt. With a mighty shove, he sent the truck down a small incline, rear doors flapping wildly, away from the warehouses full of precious whiskey. As the truck lurched to a stop against a large pile of rubbish, Malcolm brushed his hands together and strode toward the warehouse, and Alison braced herself to examine what must be horrific burns. She hurried to his side, all but dragging him down an alley between two buildings to a place of relative safety should the truck explode again.
Let me see your hands. You should not have done something so foolish.
Her heartbeat tripled its rate as she thought of him injured. Beyond the desire to heal, she didn't understand why it mattered to her so much. She'd treated patients before with severe wounds and felt little more than compassion and a professional detachment. Odd that a self-proclaimed Scottish ghost would prove different. He allowed her to inspect his hands. "Lass, 'tis about time you understood I truly am a ghost. 'Tis my jacket, not my hands, that dinna fare so well." She dragged her astonished gaze from his unscarred palms to his coat, where tiny puffs of smoke issued from the charred cuffs.
You knew the fire wouldn't hurt you?
His face twisted with uncertainty. "I didn't think it would. For all my blustering about being a ghost and unable to be harmed further, I didn't truly know." He shrugged. "Until the wood spike. It didn't hurt, well, nae much, and I already cost you time when I slipped into my memories. I had to try." Alison's gaze slid to the truck, now several safe yards away, the fire in the cargo space apparently contained, hopefully dying.
You risked your life to save the whiskey?
"As a Scotsman, I'd gladly say aye, and a noble cause at that." He teased her gently. "But as your friend, I say I would risk my life to save yours, if I truly had a life to give." He nodded to the warehouses around them, bathed in a dancing orange glow. "This represents your future. That would have burned quickly and likely sent flaming barrels down the hill to the distillery. Every distiller's nightmare." She nodded, still numb from the thought of what he'd risked. Smoke inhalation, devastating burns, certain death again. And in her heart she began to believe. Sorrow washed over her. The feelings she'd had of friendship, no, closer than that, would amount to nothing, and it grieved her.
Thank you. It sounds completely inadequate, but thank you.
"Ugh, you already knew I didn't fear fire." His grin was genuine, but his eyes remained clouded.
I've seen you smile, but I've never heard you laugh.
To her dismay, his smile disappeared. "I've nae mirth left in my lass, only the memories."
And they haunt you more than you haunted the moor?
He quirked an eyebrow at her, and half his smile returned. "Well put. Eternal rest is the best answer. May it be peaceful if I am successful here."
No. There are ways to help you, even Fergus.
She glanced about her for the Westie, but didn't see him. "Whether my quest is finished or not, I only had a day's time to complete it," he sighed. "Soni will be for me soon." Alison reached for his hands again.
We will get her to let you stay. You should experience life. Laugh again.
Her gaze slid to his.
Perhaps love.
His eyes rounded, wistful. "I dinna deserve all that, lass, much as I would like it. Only my final reckoning, which I dinna look forward to."
You are kind. Do not believe the things your dark thoughts tell you. As a soldier, you followed orders. You did what you could. There is nothing to regret.
"Nay, 'tis not about what I did, 'tis about what I dinna do, and that I regret very much." His eyes darkened, and Alison feared she was losing him again. She gripped his arms, giving him a shake.
Do not give in. Your heart is so kind.
Tears burned in her eyes.
And I care so much.
"My friends were herded into the loch like so much cattle," he murmured. "Drowned as though their lives meant nothing. I could have saved them, but I did nothing."
You could not have saved them. And you survived. They would have killed you too. Is that what you wanted?
His tortured gaze broke Alison's heart. "Aye, I should have died with them." She pulled him unresistingly against her chest, wrapping her arms about him. She held him tight, thrilling to the way he filled her arms, the way his warmth soaked into her bones, her heart. He straightened, reversing their positions so that she cuddled against his chest, his arms holding her close. His heartbeat thudded gently beneath her ear, proof that for the time at least he was alive. The faint odour of smoke mingled with the manly scent filled her nostrils, and she breathed deep. She warmed to the sensation of being in his arms. It was perfect, except she tilted her face up, seeking his lips with hers. She found them warm and chiselled and firm, but they softened quickly at her touch. A small groan rumbled in his chest, and he slid his mouth to her ear, his breath tickling her skin. She flinched, and his lips reclaimed hers, moving gently, as though he sought to memorize their shape. He broke the contact, leaning his forehead against hers, his eyes searching her face. "Your eyes are the colour of springtime, and your hair is so red. I almost am afraid to touch it."
"Might it burn you?"
she asked, intrigued he would think so. He lifted the curled ends of her shoulder-length bob, letting the strands trickle through his fingers. "Aye, though 'tis my heart, not my hands, that feel the flames." He kissed her again, his lips as light as a sigh. Fergus's barking pulled them apart. Cool air replaced the warmth of Malcolm's arms.
"Fergus! Come here!"
The little dog raced to her, and she galloped him up, grateful he hadn't been hurt in the blast.
"Stop straying off."
She chided as she set him on the ground.
"And thanks for taking care of the Scotsman,"
she whispered into his very ear. Straightening, she faced Malcolm.
"I need to call security. Even if the truck is no longer a danger, it must be checked, and I need to file a report for insurance."
"I will look into the buildings."
"Don't bother. We'll just check the locks while we wait. I don't know where Sandy went, and we don't need to let him get the drop on us if he's still around."
She dug into her pocket for her cell phone, staring at it with a frown.
"Rats! No signal. These things are useless up here."
She shoved it back in her pocket and held up the empty pouch she'd clipped on her belt earlier.
"Must have lost the walkie-talkie in the leaves near the springs. Let's use the phone in the break room. The men have a small building for eating and such. There's a phone in there."
They strolled to the far side of the warehouses to a much smaller building with a single man-sized door. The entry stood ajar. A flash of unease washed over her. She stepped inside, but one glance at the phone, its cord hanging free from the receiver, told her it was useless.
"Well, I guess we'll just go get help ourselves."
Making their way to the ATV, she pushed the starter button, and Malcolm and Fergus wedged inside once again. The Westie sat upright in Malcolm's lap, appearing to enjoy Malcolm's steadying hand on his flank. It gave Alison strength in this day of troubles and disappointments to have the Scotsman at her side, and her heart smiled. Chapter 11. The cool breath of evening filled Malcolm's chest. It was the heady feel of freedom, and for the first time in nearly 3 centuries, he noticed the wink of stars as, one by one, they took their place in the velvet sky. Already the moon rose high above the trees, casting a pure white light on the narrow road as Alison guided the vehicle skillfully down the hill. As they exited the trees into the cleared area around the distillery and crossed the dam next to the lake, the sky flashed yellow and orange behind them with a loud clap of sound. Alison brought the vehicle to a screeching stop, skidding it off the road as she wrenched the wheel, facing the way they'd come. Fire lit the hillside, careening off trees, shooting into the air as it bounced over boulders. In an instant, Malcolm realized the flaming barrels tumbling down were headed straight for them. "Go!" he shouted, but Alison had stepped to the ground, hands clenched at her sides, rigid with anger or fear, he couldn't tell. "Get in," he commanded, his voice harsh.
No.
She breathed, the word full of anguish, not argument. Fergus jumped to the rear of the vehicle with an excited bark as Malcolm climbed out. "Get us out of here," Malcolm shouted as he grabbed Alison's arm, giving her a brief shake.
Sandy fired the warehouses anyway,
She flung at him, jerking from his grip as she started up the track. "Aye, and we must stop him. Get in. We can do nothing from here, and would be less than worthless on that hill. We must get help." She shot him one last defiant look, then strode toward the ATV. 2 steps away, something crashed into her shoulder, and she plummeted over the edge of the road into the dark, cold lake. Malcolm careened around the corner of the vehicle, gripping the metal roll bar for balance. He halted in a scramble of rocks and debris at the edge of the road. Confusion rolled over him as the ghosts of men he'd once known sailed down the hill. His heart clenched as the first ones entered the water, their cries sizzling on the night air. "No!" Shots splattered the surface, forcing the men in Malcolm's tortured memory beneath the water to their deaths. Bullets slid through the water with a sinister hiss, leaving twisting plumes of smoke in their wake. Fergus nudged his furry head beneath Malcolm's hand, and he began to stroke the wiry fur. His breathing evened, his vision cleared. The ghosts disappeared, becoming barrels of burning whiskey, bounding down the hill and into the lake. Some, broken against boulders, sent fiery brands into the water, hissing as they made contact. Smoke spiraled from the surface. The lake glowed as though lit from within. Alison's head, her red hair a dark stain on the water, bobbed close to the debris. "Come on, lass, climb out." Alison did not respond to his silent plea. A barrel burst overhead, spraying whiskey. His dread grew. In an instant, she could be engulfed in flames. "I can't enter the water again." Even as he voiced his fear, he quickly unwrapped his leggings and stepped out of his boots, tossing his jacket to the ground. A deep breath, then too, as the icy touch of sheer terror washed over him. Fergus licked his hand, crooning encouragingly. Squaring his shoulders, Malcolm dove into the lake, barely noting the chill as the water closed over his head. He surfaced, finding himself only a few feet from Alison's still body. Flaming bits of barrels bobbed closer, adding heat to the water as they approached. With strong strokes, he swam to her side. He pulled her against him and began the trek to shore, away from the whiskey that now burned on the surface of the water, spreading eagerly outward. The bank was sloped, but the bottom of the lake dropped off sharply at the waterline. With a bit of difficulty, he shoved Alison onto the bank, clear of the burning lake, and far enough to ensure she did not slip back into the water. He floated, treading water, as he searched the bank for an easier way out. Something crashed into his skull, the force sending him deep underwater. He gulped a mouthful of lake water in surprise and immediately choked. He struggled upward toward the leaping, flaming light, but a barrel passed overhead, obscuring his line of sight. Then another, and another, blocking his way out. He pushed at a barrel, but it bumped into a neighbour, refusing to give way. Kicking his feet, he slid through the water beneath the barrels, searching for an opening. His vision dimmed, and his movements slowed, his arms and legs cumbersome. Panic rose and fell in his chest. Ghost or not, this time he would drown. Alison retched a bellyful of lake water onto the damp earth beside her. Fingers curved into claws, she pulled herself up the bank, fiery heat at her back. Her hands touched crumbling asphalt, and she halted, exhausted. Sirens split the air, shouts rose from the distillery, barrels cracked open with exploding force. The tang of whiskey and smoke, normally two of her favourite smells, choked the very life from the air.
This must be what war is like.
She jerked to attention.
Malcolm!
Pulling herself to her elbows, she scanned the area, searching for the Scotsman, the flap of a kilt, the broad shoulders, anything that would point her to him. Had he pulled her from the lake? Deep water was his greatest fear, since almost drowning nearly 300 years ago. Was that what was meant by facing his fears? Had he survived the test? She turned to the lake. Barrels bobbed on the surface, some burning brightly, others doused or nearly so. Their various depths indicated the amount of whiskey each held. Flames licked across the water, illuminating the surface, but the barrels cast deep shadows, confusing the eye.
Malcolm!
Her voice, hoarse and weak, couldn't possibly have carried far. She dragged herself to her feet, pausing once as a wave of nausea swept over her. White and red lights ripped through the night, and a fire truck's scream reverberated in the hills. Headlights blinded her, and she slipped a couple of steps back down the bank, catching herself with her hands on the soft soil. She flinched as the truck rushed past, barely missing the ATV sitting at a drunken angle on the side of the road, its wheels in the mud. Two more fire trucks, followed by a pickup crammed to overflowing with men in the back, drove by. Taillights flashed, then vanished around the bend. She grabbed a long stick and returned to the bank, shoving barrels aside, scanning the water for signs of the Scotsman. Nearly invisible flames lapped at the shore, and a river of burning whiskey flowed in rivulets through the trees. The heat and stench of it was near to overwhelming. She spotted a dark lump sprawled on the shore.
There!
Dashing around the smouldering debris, she headed for the still form. A green glow backlit two upright figures, one in a long robe, the other in a kilt. Alison slowed her steps, advancing with caution. Malcolm turned at her approach, relief stamped on his face. "Soni told me you were out of danger, but I'm thankful to see you. 'Tis a sad night I'm leaving you with, lass," he said, his voice low and sympathetic. He grasped her upper arms, facing her away from the body on the bank. "'Tis your cousin, Robert. In my day, 'twould be a mercy to end his pain, but mayhap your modern medicine can cure him." She jerked around at his words. The robed figure knelt at Robert's side, then glanced up at Alison. The woman tilted her head.
He rests now, with a bit of my help. I draped a bit of wet fabric from my cloak over his back to keep his skin moist, and halted time for him. He needs medical attention quickly. His burns are life-threatening.
Alison flung herself to the ground next to Robert, trained hands and eyes cataloguing his wounds. She lifted the remains of his jacket, her gorge rising as she registered the extent of his burns. He did not rouse.
Oh, Robert, what have you done?
Chapter 12. Malcolm clasped her shoulder gently. "Dinna fash, lass. He isna in pain. Soni has seen to that. I spoke to him before she set him beyond time. He told me he was desperate, thinking you'd turn him into the police for his actions at the Springs earlier. Nothing had gone according to his and Sandy's plans, and when he saw the burning whiskey barrels coming down the hill, he thought to join one last chance to vent his spleen before being hauled away." Alison shivered, and Malcolm draped his jacket across her shoulders. "But then he saw ye standing next to the lake. He needed ye out of the way, so he could get up the hill to help Sandy. He swore he hadn't meant to hit you so hard, nor send you into the lake with the whiskey burning the water. Alison turned tear-filled eyes to him.
What happened? How did he get here then?
It doesn't like me much. Malcolm rubbed a spot on his head. He hit me with a large rock as I pulled you from the lake, and I went under. The barrels rolled over the top of me, preventing me from reaching the surface. I thought I would drown. Me, a ghost. His harsh snort startled Alison. But as I felt myself fading, your cousin grabbed my arm and hauled me out. Unfortunately for him, I'm the largest man, and he slipped and fell into the water.
Why did he rescue you?
All he would say as he changed his mind, Malcolm shrugged. 'Twas the pain talking, I'm certain. I believe his hands were burnt shoving the barrels aside, the rest when he struck the patch of flames. Alison eyed Robert's injuries in the dim, flickering light. His hair was burned away on one side of his head, leaving a large, shiny white patch that might have been bone. His jacket hung in charred tatters, and the one hand she could see was a dull, matte black.
I am truly sorry for your troubles. There are still a few minutes before I must take Malcolm away. Is there aught else we can do to help?
Alison slid her gaze to the young woman next to her. The firelight cast her features in stark relief, emphasizing the bones of her face and casting unusually large shadows beneath her wide eyes.
Who are you? My name is Soni. I'm here to collect Malcolm. You're the witch.
At the woman's nod, despair weighted Alison's shoulders.
You can't have him. I need him to help me rebuild the distillery.
She cast a look at Malcolm, emboldened by the intensity of his gaze. She rose and stepped to his side.
I need his wisdom and his strength.
She grasped his hand in one of hers, wrapping the other around his upper arm and leaning close.
And I need his heart.
Malcolm's eyes closed as if in pain, then reopened, the sorrow within tearing at her. Lass, I must go. I am honoured to have been of service this day, though devastated to leave ye in such straits. He shuffled his feet and cupped her cheek in his palm. If ever I was tempted to avoid my fate, it would be here with ye. One corner of his lips tilted up. Ye are bonny for a Sutherland, lass, and brave. His voice lowered. And beautiful. A sob lodged in her throat, and she buried her face in his chest.
Please don't leave me. Who else will call me a lass and give me sweet kisses when I need them?
Fergus lapped against her leg, and she choked on a laugh as she ruffled his ears.
Not yours, Fergus. Malcolm's.
She glanced up.
It doesn't seem possible you interrupted my morning just today as a tourist. You are so much more.
She faced the witch.
I don't know what it would take to change your mind, but I would plead with you. He did his heroic deed and more.
Stepping toward Soni, she enumerated on her fingers.
He has PTSD, undiagnosed but quite apparent, and Fergus has calmed him more than once. He deserves a life free of such painful memories, and I can help.
She held up her second finger.
He is loyal and has stuck by me from one trial to the next today. A weaker man would have given up hours ago.
She reached her third finger.
He faced his greatest fear when he jumped into this lake to save me. I have seen his memories come over him, paralyzing him, plunging him into grief and regret. But he did it anyway, for me, and I'll never forget it.
With a jolt, she lifted her hand, 4 fingers splayed.
He is kind, honest, and brave.
She spread all 5 fingers.
And I love him.
At their feet, Robert moaned softly. Torn, Alison moved to his side, gently stroking the side of his face.
He is rousing. My spell will wear off him soon, and you must get him to a hospital. I am sorry, Alison, but I must take a spirit back with me. I cannot break the agreement.
Me. The word was a cracked whisper of sound. Alison leaned closer.
Robert, don't move. There will be an ambulance here soon. I am sure one or more is on its way just behind the fire trucks.
She glanced up the hill where flames glowed with fierce intensity. Robert's good hand shot out, capturing her wrist in an urgent grip. I heard I won't make it. Feel it. Here. He coughed, his mouth twisting in a grimace. Good man. Deserves better than I do. Dinna see such things, lad, Malcolm murmured, drawing near. Our medicines can cure ye, and ye should have your second chance. Robert's eyes widened, girlish, without lashes or brows, his skin slick and pink. Let me, one good deed. His breath rattled in his chest. One good deed. You may not take another's life to spare Malcolm's, a new voice intoned. A well-dressed man, white satin-lined black cape tossed over his shoulder, stood to one side of Sancerre. That would break the agreement.
I understand, Uncle. Where is the line when his wishes are clear and intervention is already too late? Supposing I had the gift of healing.
His sacrifice could cloud any relationship between the pair. He nodded to Alison and Malcolm. Will their bond withstand it?
You know, I can't see the future, Uncle. Nor can you.
Her uncle sighed. The woman loses a treacherous cousin and gains a loyal Scotsman who gives her sweet kisses. The downturn of his lips emphasised his scepticism. He looked to Malcolm. And ye intend to help her rebuild her life? Aye, if it's granted me, I will help her rebuild whatever has been destroyed. Malcolm glanced at Alison. No matter the journey. Lights flashed behind them, raking the hillside, and a white ambulance skidded to a halt next to them, wheels crunching on the crumbling asphalt. Do you folks need help? A man asked through the open window.
My cousin has second and third degree burns over his hand, head, and back. He requires immediate attention.
Alison stated, her nursing training taking over. Both cab doors flew open, and a third man jumped from the rear of the ambulance, light from the compartment spilling out onto the ground. One EMT hurried to Robert's side, in murmured conference with Alison, who listed his symptoms with detached professional calm. Suddenly, the EMT rolled Robert onto his back, giving his chest a resounding whack. His shoulders pumped up and down as he began CPR, and within moments the men had Robert's body on the gurney and inside the ambulance. Doors thudded closed, and the siren roared to life as they raced back down the road. A few minutes later, the lights vanished. Alison retraced her steps to Malcolm's side. A shooting star arced overhead.
He is gone,
Sancerre murmured. With a silent prayer, Alison sagged against Malcolm. His arm circled her shoulders comfortingly and pulled her close. Sancerre and her uncle exchanged glances. So be it, the man intoned. His life was used selfishly, but spent in honour trying to atone. I will grant his wish.
Who is that? And what does he mean?
Alison murmured into Malcolm's ear. She glanced about, startled to find the strange man gone.
And where did he go? That was my uncle. And he means your cousin's last actions were an unselfish desire to see you happy, which meant exchanging his life for Malcolm's.
She regarded them sternly.
That doesn't mean he died so Malcolm could live, but rather he offered his space on this earth once he didn't need it anymore, for Malcolm, should he wish it.
Tears clouded Alison's eyes, and hope squeezed her chest.
Malcolm?
I dinna know what to think, lass, he admitted, clearly stunned. Can we alter the bargain? He asked Soni.
Uncle has allowed it, but only because of your love for each other, and because your cousin offered the exchange without coercion.
Soni tilted her head at Malcolm.
Would you trade your chance to speak with Sherlock for a life with this lass?
A grin split Malcolm's face, and laughter roared from his chest. My meeting with a prince in exchange for a Sutherland lass. He pulled Alison into his arms and kissed her soundly. Aye.
Then you best travel up yon hill and see to saving the distillery.
The green glow surrounding her began to dim.
Farewell, my friend.
She gifted Alison a sweet smile.
Life with this one will be interesting, but he deserves all the joy your life together has to offer.
Her look turned wistful.
I wish you both many happy years.
She faded and was gone.
What do you suppose she meant?
That we live long and happily, Malcolm replied, a wondering note to his voice.
No, not her words. The way she looked at us, as though she was gifting us something she wished she could have.
Malcolm hugged her tight. 'Twas a trick of the light, lass. Our Soni is a bonny lass who has bargained for the lives of 79 ghosts. She simply has her hands full. He chucked her beneath her chin. And we have ours full as well. Alison eyed the burning path through the woods, the flaming river of whiskey flowing through the trees, drying to a mere trickle. A fire truck parked to one side, one hose pumping water from the lake, another spewing water over the fire, keeping it from spreading into the forest. Above the tree line, the wild dance of flames had diminished, the white glare of spotlights replacing the churn of orange and gold.
It looks as though we might be able to drive up to the ridge. With luck, it was only the one warehouse, and they've protected the others.
She and Malcolm climbed into the ATV. Malcolm thumped the bed behind him with a fist. Fergus, up! With a scramble to the floorboard, over the seat and to the space behind, Fergus bounded into his appointed spot with an excited bark. Alison manoeuvred the ATV to a spot indicated to her by the fire chief. She and Malcolm stepped to the ground with a firm command to Fergus to stay. The fire chief wiped a streak of smoke residue across his forehead. I believe we have it contained to just the one warehouse, he told her. We don't dare leave until it's completely out, but, barring other incidents, this should be completely under control soon. Alison grimaced. She knew exactly what other incidents meant.
Have you seen Sandy?
As a matter of fact, I have. The fire chief motioned for her to follow and led her behind the next warehouse, where the sheriff's SUV sat, lights bouncing off the metal siding. The chief gestured to the tall, thin man in a khaki uniform, capturing his attention as he passed Alison and Malcolm over. Talk to Will. I'll see you later. The fire chief turned back to the fire. The sheriff beckoned Alison closer, opening the rear door of the SUV. The cabin light came on, shining on Sandy. He glared at her, hands tucked behind his back. Will leaned against the open door, arms folded across his chest. It's a singularly odd thing to arrive at the scene of a fire and find a seemingly intelligent man hiding in a warehouse full of whiskey next to the one burning to the ground, Will drawled. Can't say as I've ever seen anything like it. He glanced at Alison. He says he's innocent, but my mama would tan my hide if I didn't ask for your side of the story. Alison's temper boiled.
Your mama would be proud of you, Will, for capturing the man who tried to destroy my distillery.
It wasn't me. It was your stupid, greedy cousin, Robert. Sandy squirmed beneath the weight of 3 speculative gazes.
Check the white truck behind Warehouse F. You'll likely find his fingerprints all over it, and what's left of the contents, if there are any.
Alison added silently, praying the truck hadn't been consumed in the blaze along with the proof.
He'd meant to start the fire with a timed explosion from the truck, but Malcolm and I interrupted him. and managed to move the truck before its fire spread. I couldn't reach security on my cell phone up here in these blasted mountains and lost my walkie-talkie sometime earlier today. So we headed back down the hill to get help.
She shuddered, and Malcolm settled a calming hand on her shoulder. Will pushed away from the door and bent to peer at his prisoner. "Well, Sandy, looks like you're going to stay seated all nice and tight in my car until I get you transferred to jail. Should have lit out when you had a chance." He grinned as he straightened and faced Alison and Malcolm. "Sorry about that, no pun intended." Alison closed her eyes briefly in pained response. "Get Robert!" Sandy shouted from inside the SUV. "He's part of this." Will slammed the door shut. "What's this about Robert? Any truth to that?" Alison sagged, and Malcolm wrapped an arm about her waist. "The loss is fair pigged, but I can tell you what you need to know." "A Scot?" Will took to his full height, a quizzical look on his face as he eyed Malcolm. "My granddaddy had a kilt like that one, same colour though not nearly so worn." His eyebrow quirked upward. "Not many men around here can wear something like that and not get laughed at." Malcolm stared down his good-natured teasing, and Will gave a soft laugh. "Be damned, you're a Sinclair." At Malcolm's nod, he chuckled and extended his hand.
"Wait a minute. You're not a Sinclair, Will Marshall?"
The sheriff grinned. "Nope, but my mama was, and I have the tartan to prove it." Malcolm perked up. "Good to meet you, Will. I'm Malcolm Sinclair, lately of Scotland, and if I dinna anger my wee Sutherland lass, I'll be making my home here." He shook hands with the sheriff. Will nodded. "Tell me about her rascally cousin, then take her home. She looks like she's about to collapse." Ignoring Alison's sputtered protest, Malcolm gave Will a brief summary of the day's events, excluding his reason for being here beyond that of a besotted tourist, and omitting Soni and her uncle's appearance. He slid a look to Alison as he gave Will the bad news about Robert. "I dinna think you'll make it." Will shook his head. "I'll check with the hospital on Robert's condition, though you're right, it doesn't sound good." He gave Malcolm a shrewd look. "Welcome to the neighbourhood, Malcolm. You got a fine lass here, even if she's a Sutherland." This has been Malcolm, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 16, written by Cathy McRae, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Copyright 2016 by Catherine Ann Dodson. Production copyright by Catherine Ann Dodson.